for me again. You hold me down for a very long time. Can't buy sugar, we can't buy lime. Can't buy scandal, we can't buy time. You can't fool me again. Can't fool me again. You can't fool me again. Hold me down for a very long time. Can't buy sugar, we can't buy lime. You touch up line and I resort to crime. You can't fool me again.
What people do eat no money, what they at you, eat no at you. Covid money, miss away in the yellow rat you. Use the youth, them money, waste my must have mantis statue. Say me like a catch you, but they got in a figure you. Take this print of money, God and say that it's not you. One day the man above him up, him a got up. Too much eating at the kitchen, some a fly by like a patu. My singers and DJs and social media's coming at you.
It burn me
300% free.
It burn me
garbage pile of the day.
It burn me
Give the teacher them raise.
It burn me
I see corruption face.
It burn me
Mash down the people them house.
It burn me
Every day appear arms out.
It burn me
Appear money them a thief.
It burn me
And them a sell out the beach.
Can't fool me again. You can't fool me again. You hold me down for a very long time. Can't buy sugar, we can't buy lime. Can't buy scandal, we can't buy time. You can't fool me again. Can't fool me again. You can't fool me again. You hold me down for a very long time. Can't buy sugar, we can't buy lime. You touch up line and I resort to crime. You can't fool me again.
Come me say big up all the charities and all of the givers. Some a go like say them powerful, me no make a bigger. The 100 the promises, none of them no deliver. Cut up the youth, they rap and they down in our fever. Member bowl honey and they lie them tell. Corruption smell and they pocket them swell. When police don't a market like Satan out of hell, go mash up people start like thief when them sell.
It burn me
Or they treat the market man.
It burn me
Or them a treat the cat man.
It burn me
Or they treat the peanut man.
It burn me
Or them a treat the dirt man.
It burn me
Or them a treat the son man.
It burn me
Or them a treat policeman.
It burn me
How them a treat soldier man.
It burn me
How them a treat everyone.
Can't fool me again. You can't fool me again. You hold me down for a very long time. Can't buy sugar, we can't buy lime. Can't buy scandal, we can't buy time. You can't fool me again. Can't fool me again. You can't.
Good night, good night, good night, and welcome. The day I'm back in my one suit again. I went to sleep, and now I've woken up with a much fresher mind, wanting to ask Peter Bunting some question. Good evening to those who are on the live at the moment. Good evening to those in the chat. Good evening to those on the Twitch, on X, on Facebook, on YouTube. Once again, we apologize for not being on TikTok all day, but we will resume our TikTok broadcasts on Monday because you all know tomorrow is Saturday and one will have the day for themselves. But since me come on stream, I'm looking and I realize I do not have a photograph of Peter Bunting in queue. But I will still ask Peter Bunting tonight. Were you at the Silvera residence on the night of the murder? Were you the first person to get there? And if you were, what was the state of the scene of crime? And if you were the first person to get there also, who came after you? Does anyone here knows who in the People's National Party drives SUVs? Who in the People's National Party? Who are the big wigs in the People's National Party that drive SUVs? But I want to say good evening and welcome to everyone on the chat this evening. Good evening to Alison David. Good evening to VM. Beat and Teach. Good evening. Good evening to Professor Gorgeous Lady. Good evening to Cousin Jamie. Good evening and welcome. Good evening to Lilith Foster. Good evening to Sunshine. Sunshine, good evening. Good evening to who else is here. I don't want to miss anyone. Natalia Freeman, good evening, and welcome. Parkins, good evening and welcome. Good evening, Kate. Good evening, Heather Dunkley. Good evening, who else is here? Good evening, JB. Good evening, Miranda. Good evening, Angela. Good evening and welcome. Good evening, Angela Museden. Sorry. Good evening and welcome. Good evening, Paula Facey. Good evening and welcome. Good evening, Carl Thomas. Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for joining this evening. Good evening, Mystic Sensation. Good evening and welcome. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening. The white sheet of the cover-up is slowly unveiling. We know Silvera should be charged for more than just the murder of Melissa Silvera. But Julian Silvera should not be the only one to be charged in the investigation of the death of Melissa Silvera. The reason being, sorry, I'm just doing things while I'm talking to you. The reason being, there's a huge cover-up following the death. An almighty cover-up followed the death of Melissa. That doesn't only involve Julian Silvera. It involves much more people, a wider group of those in high society, a much wider group of those in high society. A fleet of SUV, it said, visited the Silvera's residence during the night of the 10th of November into the morning of the 11th of November. A lot of lies were being told over those 2 days period to the public. A lot of people assisted in that lie that involves that entire cover-up. Just spare me a second. A lot of people are involved in the lie that protected the cover-up until the pathologists say not quite so. Debbie Jervis, good evening. Angela Costley, good evening. I want to say, Sandra Morgan, good evening, Jamaican Carlos, good evening and welcome. Sonia Wint, good evening and welcome. Good evening to you all and welcome to our program this evening. I really appreciate your all support. Rochelle Brown, good evening and welcome. Good evening to all my globalists. Good evening and welcome. It's a continuation of our special coverage that we're doing all day today. I want to say an amazing thanks on behalf of Global TV and the entire Globalist team. I want to say a major thank you to Debbie Jervis, our North American correspondent today, who gave us an amazing report and feedback on the ground from what happened at the Call to Action protest. Mystic Vibes, good evening and welcome. Thank you very much, Debbie, for all your amazing support. Thank you for a well-spent, well-reported day. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate your support. Wellness Warrior, good night. And this is one of the ways that Global TV want to, Amazing Grace, good evening, want to expand in the space is to wherever things is going on that need to be highlighted, we could get a local reporter on the ground to put the information out there to the people so all could know what is going on. Miranda Roddick, good evening and welcome. Maria Williams, good evening and welcome. VM, good evening and welcome. I want to play you something Fitz Daly said before we go forward. Let me know in the chat if you're hearing.
As the police continue its investigation in the murder of Melissa Silvera on Friday, the 19th of January, 2024, after a question and answer session at the Major Investigation Division Office, about 12 midday, Jolan Silvera, age 52 years old, land developer of 2A Diamond Court, Stony Hill, St. Andrew, was formally charged by the police, that is the Major Investigation Division, for the murder of his wife, Melissa Silvera. The investigation continues as we believe that there are other charges that will be laid against Mr. Silvera. I wish to express appreciation and thanks to every member of the investigative team, those at Major Investigation Division led by Superintendent Hilton. I think it was a very professional, very thorough and comprehensive investigation that was done. It also demonstrated that the JCF is progressing very well and there is great integration of all the various departments within the force as we seek to create a safer Jamaica. I want to also express thanks to the public for whatever support they have given us. We believe that our stakeholders are very important to us achieving our objective as law enforcement officers in another country. I also want to appeal to Jamaica that we collectively can make Jamaica a safer place if we all work together for the common good of this nation. Again, thanks to the team, and we'll continue to act professionally in all the matters that are brought before us. Gentlemen, cyber forensics and that kind of thing. How much can you share with us about that aspect of the investigation and what the harm it has to bring us to this point of a charge? All right, I will answer the part regarding. As you know, the JCF continues to explore science as an important part of what we do. And in this investigation, all the sciences were applied, from cyber, ballistics, telecommunications, all of those sciences were applied. And I will hasten to say that this case was not one of the easiest one for us, but because there is a level of competence within the organization. We have the skill sets, very bright individuals who are well trained at a first world standard. And this has resulted into us achieving what we have achieved. We have some excellent investigators. I mean, Mr. Hilton is leading a team of professional.
Sorry, I have to stop that. Because when me there screen recorded, me getting a coughing fit. But an aspect of what he said he had, I want to say hello to a few people. Wellness Warrior, Sophie, good evening. Adi James, good evening. JB, or here, good evening. Who else has arrived? But a part of that, when he was saying the type of investigation they deployed, cyber, forensics, telecommunication, that one stuck with me. Oh yes, the telecommunication one jammed me because I know that would be and should be an active part of the investigation. Verona Shaw, good evening and welcome. The telecommunication aspect is a crucial part of the investigation, not just with regards to Melissa Silvera's death, but more so, Flo M, good night and welcome, more so to do with the litany of cover-ups that followed the killing. Again, I'm so unprepared. I have a statement that was released by the People's National Party. And in that statement they released, they spoke about other recent deaths. I kid you not. They spoke about other recent deaths. They spoke of other recent deaths, a counselor that was killed. They condemned the other day the death of the paralegal that was shot a couple days ago. But even in the statement they put out on January 18, declared zero tolerance. They were the shadow Minister for Gender condemned recent violent attack on women, declare zero tolerance. Me can't read them fine writing. After me done, I'm going to post on Facebook, because if I go in the studio now to put it in via my phone, it's going to give you an awful sound. So I don't want to do that. But unless me not too bright like Fitzbailey, unless me not too bright like Reverend Fitzbailey, of these violence against women that the PNP is talking about in this press release, it would seem in the press release from the People's National Party that Melissa Silvera still died peacefully in her sleep. Because if not so, then like they've mentioned other women who violence have met out to of recent, they would have remembered her as well. Or you may want to ask yourself your question. When it comes to the name Melissa Silvera, why is the People's National Party so silent? Why is there such an awful silence in the People's National Party? Who silence is protecting? Andrea Joan Hamilton Wilson, good evening and welcome. Diane Campbell, how are you? How are you? Long time no see. How you doing? Who are they covering up for? Who are they protecting in this wall of silence? That even a member of their political clique in the People's National Party who was murdered, a female, and they're talking about violence, zero tolerance, violence against women. But Melissa Silvera died peacefully, even when all of us know since mid-December that that was a lie. That was a lie. And not only that it was a lie, but a lot of people helped to protect that lie. Probably sitting politicians in the People's National Party, active members of the People's National Party. Let me play back a news. I don't know, help me listen, because remember me done at times, you know. Help me to listen what this recording is saying. Listen if you hear it say anything about a prominent, a wife of a prominent People's National Party member. Listen, please.
Criminal charges are expected to be laid on former Member of Parliament for West St. Mary and Chairman of the People's National Party's founders group, Julian Silvera, after ballistics tests reportedly connected his firearm to the brutal murder of his wife, Melissa. The former MP is set to face murder-related charges in the coming hours. He remains in jail this morning. He is to undergo a final round of interrogation by detectives. More in this report. Silvera was picked up last evening at an Upper St. Andrew house by detectives from the Jamaica Constabulary Forces Major Investigation Division, MID. He was led away in handcuffs to the MID's headquarters on Spanish Town Road, then whisked away to a police lockup in the corporate area where he spent the night behind bars. It was initially reported that Melissa Silvera died in her sleep. However, a post-mortem later disclosed that she was shot at least 3 times. Following this development, the police questioned Silvera twice and seized his licensed firearm and his mobile phone. Extensive forensic work has reportedly established a connection between Silvera's gun and the murder of his wife, with whom he had a turbulent relationship. It's believed Melissa was gunned down at the couple's home in Stony Hill, St. Andrew. Melissa's murder has sent shockwaves through the country. Her husband, Julian, who's now a suspect in her murder, is a high-profile former member of parliament. Up to the point where the death of his wife was treated as a murder investigation, he was busy on the campaign trail for the PNP and has been photographed in the company of the opposition leader. Melissa was the goddaughter of former Prime Minister and ex-PNP President P.J. Patterson. Her family is highly regarded in the halls of the PNP. In a heartfelt written tribute that was included in the program at her funeral, which was held 2 weeks ago, Mr. Patterson grieved for Melissa, whom he described as his niece. The former Prime Minister expressed condolences to Melissa's 3 boys, but did not mention by name her late husband, Julian Silvera. The police investigation into the murder of Melissa Silvera has led to statements being taken from several people who visited the scene after news surfaced of her demise. A statement was reportedly collected from PNP Vice President and Member of Parliament for North West Manchester, Michael Phillips. It's understood that the police also made arrangements to collect a statement from the wife of a high-profile PNP politician who visited the bloody scene when news surfaced that Melissa died in her sleep. It's not immediately clear if that statement was collected. Statements have also reportedly been collected from individuals who Mr. Silvera is alleged to have told that Melissa had passed away in her sleep while she was in his company. Julian Silvera is reportedly strongly denying wrongdoing. The embattled PNP politician has hired King's Counsel Peter Champagny. Champagny is expected.
Hold on. So this would be saying, based on this media report, Bobby Montague would have been questioned who he spoke to. Mark Golden would have been questioned. Kamala Forbes and others would have been questioned. Nicola Walker Rodin, good afternoon, good night and welcome. Douglas Allen, good night and welcome. Elaine Tucker, good night and welcome. Who is the member, the wife of the high-profile politician who visited the scene, the bloody scene, the media said? The wife of the high-profile politician who visited the scene. Why were you questioning Miguel Phillips? Were you one of those who turned up in the SUV? Was advice of any sort from you? I want to answer something somebody said in here. In a case like this, or any criminal case that the police is investigating, they cannot come and tell us in public, line by line, the evidence that they have against an accused. What they can do and what is the protocol in an active crime like this. They can tell us who they are investigating, who are suspects, what lines of inquiry they are looking at. Sometimes not all, but the ones that can be said in public, they should disclose. It's how the democratic process works. Remember, they work for us. They are our servants. So they're meant to, when they're doing a job on our behalf, they report back to us. This is the whole reason for a press conference. When things like this is happening, there ought to be an update to the public. What lines of inquiries are you following? Who and how much suspects you may be investigating? The information you can give to the public. What the lines of inquiry such as cyber forensics or other that you're following, you can say those. What you don't have to say is the detail of that. But there's a level of informing the public that must be done because we put you at work. So it's not that when there is such a case, they cannot discuss anything about it. No, there's a lot that can be said in public that will protect the case before it goes to court. That is a standard practice in normal democracies when it comes to state crime. And somebody else said today on my page as well, Golden innocent until proven guilty. So Golden couldn't make any statement before then, before the charges. No, the innocent until proven guilty means after trial. If Golden is to wait on the innocent until proven guilty, then we have to wait for the trial to go all the way through the system before Golden could say anything. No, we're talking about a matter of credibility. Once there is such a high-profile investigation in a murder charge, complex as it is, but it is not pointing into any other direction. As I repeatedly said, the political sense, the political PR sensible thing for Mount Golden to do would be to distance himself from Silvera publicly. Let me tell you why that is important to do. I'm not beating up on Mount Golden tonight. I'm just trying to explain my frustration. By the time the pathology report, but I'm going to twist back on that. By the time the pathology report came out in mid-December, human sensibility, political sensibility would have led Mount Golden and his team to understand or to understood that they were misled or lied to by Julian Silvera. We're talking about when the postmortem was released. He realized the statement he put out in public, he was lied to by Julian Silvera when he put that statement out. Sensibility tells you for your political credibility, separate yourself the earliest you can. The longer you stay, the more dangerous. That is why it is very, very important. It is for his political credibility. Why was Miguel Phillips questioned? Who was the wife of the prominent politician that the media said visited the bloody scene? Then we know how the club or the group of employees within an organization communicate. There's a whisper in the lunchroom, a whisper when we're all out having a smoke or a drink, a whisper in the corridor. If Miguel Phillips were questioned, was Miguel Phillips at the scene? The media report said the wife of a high-profile politician visited the bloody scene. What that would be telling me is within the People's National Party circle, within the wider realm of the People's National Party circle. Colin Humphreys, good night and welcome. Within the wider realm of the People's National Party circle, they knew from the very night that Mrs. Silvera was murdered. The media report said the wife of a prominent People's National Party politician visited the bloody scene. Note the word, visited the bloody scene. Not just visited the residence of the Mrs. Silvera's death, visited the bloody scene. Note the wording. So a lot of people in the PNP hierarchy knew before the postmortem, if the media report we heard just now is true, a lot of people in the People's National Party hierarchy before the postmortem results knew it was a murder. Wouldn't you agree with that? If the media report is true, that a statement is sought from the wife of a prominent politician who visited the bloody scene. And the media report says so, not me. And the talks in the corridor, how we know talks in the corridor operate. Did Ripe Mango say a little bit of blood or a lot of blood? Who assists Silvera in the cleaning up of the blood? Dr. Drayton Campbell. Who assisted Dr. Drayton Campbell, who assisted Silvera in the cleaning up of the blood? Who signed off? Who signed off, if any? Who signed off, if any, on the removal of Mrs. Silvera's body from the crime scene? Was Bobby Montague at the house on the night? Because it was said for him at the first one, would dip in him back pocket out of what him steal out of the public purse. To seek legal representation for Julian Silvera. For all the people, including the wife of the prominent politician who the media said visited the bloody scene, what were you all promised from the asset Mr. Silvera was going to secure? The asset rich that Mr. Silvera was about to come. Who did Mr. Silvera promise a share? And what share did Mr. Silvera promise all those who decide to stay silent? Was all the blood cleared up? Was all the blood cleared up before the sergeant? Kennisborough, good evening and welcome. Was all the blood cleared up, Fitzbailey, before the sergeant got there? How wide is the investigation in this cover-up, Fitzbailey? Because we cannot say there isn't a plain and blatant cover-up here. We cannot say that only Julian Silvera knew that his wife was murdered prior to the pathology report. So while Julian is arrested and charged for the murder and is awaiting further charge, probably in the line of conspiracy and concealment, it is important to know if there is an inquiry with regards to the cover-up of the death of Melissa Silvera. Those people who Fitzbailey questioned, or those people who Fitzbailey is sorting statements from, is that to do with the investigation of the death or of the cover-up? Are you, Fitzbailey, are you investigating a cover-up? We know the white sheet of the white-collar crime is being slowly lifted from different corners. Will we see any arrests in the cover-up investigation if there is one? If there's an investigation to do with the cover-up, there's a lot of tampering going with the evidence already, because Silvera was given the opportunity. You see how wide this cover-up is? high-profile people knew from the very get-go that this woman was murdered. But thank God, PJ Patterson wasn't having it. Thank God, PJ Patterson wasn't having it. Because if PJ Patterson stayed silent, like the rest of you in the People's National Party, before we saw the disgraceful spectacle of a funeral the other day, we would have seen something much more subtle, quick and fast, cremated. Silvera bullet fragment them, bapsy oopsie, them gone. And even if it came out later, I'm speaking of the cover-up plot here before. I'm speaking of the cover-up plot before the pathologist lift the lid. The possible plan was hurry up and get Melissa cremated because Julian Silvera and the rest of crooks who started to protect the cover-up immediately would want to make sure they eradicate the incident, the evidence. And if you want to think in a string, when you're building a theory, think in a string. What links to what? If it wasn't a case that they were planning such, hurry up and bury her and probably cremate her. Look at what happened before the pathology report. Julian Silvera redecorated the crime scene. Probably have the crime scene cleansed chemically before redecoration. So say that was how things was planning and it went down that far, that the pathologist works with the corruption. Mrs. Silvera is cremated. Okay, let's say after Mrs. Silvera is cremated, somebody became terribly upset because them human heart weigh upon them, or Silvera never pay up his dues to those who assist him in the cover-up. If anything comes out after Melissa body is cremated, the crime scene is redecorated. You see how it could only be a theory then, or mischief making then, because by then there wouldn't be a body to exhume for forensics. There wouldn't be a crime scene to process. Eyewitness statement alone we wouldn't have unless the children are going to speak, or was the maid there? Did the maid alert anyone? Who alerted PJ that this is not something normal? Or was it someone of the high profile people who went there in SUV inform PJ Patterson of what they knew, but thought PJ, like all of them, were going to go into absolute silence. The cover-up is much wider than we thought. The cover-up is much wider than we thought. Somebody immediately from the sergeant onward, or probably people who got there before the sergeant, are involved in a string of cover-up. Let's say the theory I explained earlier have some sense to it. Did Julian Silvera murder his wife to become asset rich, or was Julian's wife about to expose something big that would not only have an effect on Julian Silvera, but probably wider members of the People's National Party? Why Julian took his wife out? What was Mrs. Silvera? What would it have been that Mrs. Silvera was going to expose? Because this doesn't look like a crime of passion. Regardless, the murder was sadistic. I don't believe this is a crime of passion here. This was a calculated murder. This wasn't a murder born out of rage. Something happened that puts me in such a rage that I reach for my gun and point it at her and discharge it. No, if what we are hearing is true, that she was shot in her private area, then that's a cold and calculated type of murder, a premeditative murder, as would be used in the Eastern Hemisphere. But in Britain here, we would say there was intention. Will Silvera plead diminished responsibility? Is that the route? Is that the route for Silvera legal team? Will they advise him to plead guilty? Or will the court accept a diminished responsibility plea from Silvera? Diminished responsibility, meaning you are claiming mental incapability. That mental incapability doesn't mean you have to be registered psychologically unfit or unwell. It could mean that in a heated argument between Mr. and Mrs. Silvera, Mrs. Silvera could have said something to him that triggered him and snapped within that moment of that triggering word. In a moment of rage, he snapped. Diminished responsibility works like that. It doesn't have to be a long-term. Good night, Mr. British, and welcome. Good night. It doesn't have to be a long-term mental health illness for you to plead diminished responsibility. You don't have to be under psychiatric care for you to plead diminished responsibility to a crime of murder. it can work in just that snap situation where the law accepts that something triggers you and you've lost your mental capability, albeit within just a snap period. The law accepts such a defense to murder. So look out for Silvera pleading diminished responsibility. In some countries, still insanity. But in the UK now, it's called a diminished responsibility. But what Silvera covered, what was Silvera protecting in order to murder his wife? And what did Silvera promise those influential politicians of the People's National Party who were turning up to his residence that night into the morning, no doubt those in the SUVs? Because if the media report is saying the wife of a prominent politician visited the bloody murder scene, then the wider circle of People's National Party politician was fully aware from the 10th of November, that Mrs. Silvera was murdered. Sandra Levy, good night. That Mrs. Silvera was murdered. Dr. Dayton Campbell, you're going up for a seat in the next general election. We're not going to hold our peace. We're not going to hold our peace, Dr. Campbell. So if you have any involvement in the cover-up, or if you were misled by Silvera, Eldon Lewis, good evening and welcome. If you were misled by Silvera or lied to by Silvera in order to get that signing off, if you're under investigation, it may be a little bit quiet. But if you're not, wouldn't you want to clear your name before you start putting your foot down on the ground and getting yourself normalized in your constituency? Were you the first person on the scene, Peter Bunting? And if you were the first person on the scene, Peter Bunting, you would have seen the blood as well. If you were the first person on the scene, Peter Bunting, you would have seen the blood. If Peter Bunting was the first person on the scene, Peter Bunting would have seen the blood. If we're working with the media report. The media report says the wife of a permanent politician visited the bloody scene. Who is that politician's wife? Who is that politician's wife that visited the scene, the bloody scene? That person is involved in a cover-up. Who else saw the bloody scene? Camilla Forbes saw the bloody nose. Who saw the bloody scene? Peter Mercat Bunting, you were the first on scene, it is said. Patricia Matthews, good evening and welcome. It is said, Peter Bunting, that you were the first on the scene. So if that is true, you would have seen the bloody scene, because the media report says, and we must zoom in on this, the wife of a permanent politician, visited the bloody scene. Are the media sister? No, we just keep repeating it so everybody can hear say it happen. The wife of a permanent politician visited the bloody scene. So therefore, if Peter Bunting, it is said, was the first person to have got there, then Peter Bunting saw the bloody scene. Who did Peter Bunting spoke to about what he saw? But I want to go back to Fitzbailey. When he was answering the question, he was telling them the different type of evidence, because when I was answering that other question on screen, it tripped me up. Among the lines of inquiry from the technological front and forensic, they've done forensics, they've done cyber, and they've also done telecommunications, because it's the cover-up that we need to focus on here. And the telecommunication bit is the bit that we need to explore, because the telecommunication bit have a lot of evidence in it for real serious investigators who is not corrupt and covering up a crime. Now, telecommunication evidencing comes in different ways. Telecommunication evidencing come in different ways. No matter even if you're using a banger phone, there is a lot of evidence that that banger phone would provide to the investigators should they be investigating you for a crime. Let's just deal with banger phone now. We're not dealing with the upscale pretty phone them where we think say mind with business and I tell people with business. If you notice, sometimes we in our house attack and the liar phone will just come in and tell you say, I didn't hear that, say, you can use say it again, I may have to tell him to a bad word. But side of that, the telecommunication side of the investigation can give a lot of information, especially if they've taken Silvera's phone. No matter what phone you're using, there's things all around us, which is called cell site, which is a communication tower from our phone. When a call comes, when I pick up my phone to call you, the call, as quick as you see that phone start ringing, this is how speedy these things are. The signal bounces to space and pick up that satellite. Then it bounces back to whatever cell site you're near to. And that's where your phone receives its messaging through. So in your journey, your phone is going to go through tantamount of cell sites because they're everywhere all around us. So every time during your journey, your phone would be moving from one cell site to another. When you become static, mean when you're not moving, your phone cell site would stay static to the closest cell site tower, possibly next to you. That is one way of retrieving information from the telecommunication aspect. What that can do, that can place you on the crime, the scene of a crime. And it can place you on the scene of a crime with other people associated to the investigation. So from that, Fitzbailey can tell who contacted Mr. Silvera, who Mr. Silvera contacted, and what time. Also, who ended up at Mr. Silvera residence and at what time they got there. Because your cell site tower, the cell site tower would have given the information that you traveled to various cell sites until you got to the cell site tower that Mr. Silvera is connected to. It can also tell the investigators how long you were connected to that cell site tower, meaning how long you were static at Mr. Silvera's address. So there's a lot of information to have from the cell site tower information. Another side of the telecommunication aspect of the investigation is that the investigators, with a subpoena from the court, can request from whether Flow or Digicel a full download of Silvera's record for, you would say, at least a 72-hour period surround the murder. Or it could be wider. It could be a week period around the murder, and you would be looking at just before the murder, during the timeline of the murder, and after the murder if you're investigating the cover-up. So from the telecommunication aspect of the inquiry, it would be interested to know, one, if Fitzbailey is conducting an investigation with regards to the cover-up, because the telecommunication aspect of the investigation, if these people want us to believe them, because I see Fitzbailey, every time he makes a statement, he tried to convince himself that pigs have wings. We know that is impossible. We know the Reverend Fitzbailey regularly lies when he opened his mouth. He regularly tried to convince us that pigs have wings, even when Fitzbailey knows that we're not going to believe it. But if Fitzbailey wants us to believe that the JCF has integrity and the JCF is not corrupt, and the initial sergeant that visited the scene and members of the People's National Party, under 30 others, and Camilla Forbes, if you want us to believe that the JCF has integrity, explore Fitzbailey. Explore on a wider scale the cover-up. You have the technology, you have the expertise. Explore the wider aspect of the cover-up. Because no matter who is silenced in the cover-up, the cell site tower, the telecommunication aspect, the cell site tower will tell you who of these people cell site device were connected to the same cell site tower as Julian Silvera. Julian Silvera phone record would also show who Julian Silvera would have contacted 24 hours before the death of Mrs. Silvera during the period when we suspected the death of Mrs. Silvera. And 72 hours after the death of Mrs. Silvera, Julian phone record should show who he's contacted 24 hours before the death, 72 hours after the death. Who did Julian Silvera contacted 24 hours before the murder, 24 hours before the murder, or 72 hours after the murder? That would uncover a lot of people who are involved in the cover-up. His phone record would tell us who he calls 24 hours before and who he was communicating with 72 hours after. There's a lot that can be retrieved from a request from Flow or Digicel, whoever is his phone provider. Even if he sends a message from his phone and delete it, or voice recording, or even a telephone call, which is recorded and held by your telephone provider. All of that can be turned over to a court under subpoena for evidence. If Fitzbailey wants us to believe that him, Dollar Chair for Commissioner, Sleepy of a Minister of National Security, if you all want us to believe that you have integrity, unravel the scale of the cover-up we see slowly unfolding in the death of Melissa Silvera. Not only the crime against Melissa Silvera was brutal, the cover-up of the crime was heartless, likewise brutal. How do, or how will they look in the face of the Silvera's children going forward? Except for PJ Patterson, how will the fleet of People's National Party look at the Silvera's children? What will you tell them when they grow? Will you tell them that you stood up for justice for Melissa? Or shamefully, will you explain to them your involvement in the silence and the cover-up? Ado James, good night and welcome. Not only the crime that was committed against Melissa Silvera that is needed to be explored and brought to books. The crime to cover up the crime to conceal the killing, the crime to cover up the concealment and the killing is equally as gruesome, if not to us, but psychologically to the Silvera boys. Mary message for TV, good evening and welcome. The cover-up of this crime need to be explored because a lot of people are involved in the cover-up. High-profile politicians, high-profile politicians, wife of high-profile politician Joan Brown, good night and welcome, are involved in the cover-up. If we're to follow the news sourcing, going by what the news sources are saying, prominent politician wife visited the bloody scene. Who are they? Did they report a crime to the police? Did Dr. Drayton Campbell, if he was there, realize he was on the scene of a crime? Did Peter Bunting attend the crime scene? As it was said, he was the first person to have turned up or to be contacted. Did Peter Bunting realize he was on a crime scene? Did Peter Bunting report to any authority that it was a crime scene? You don't have to be in Jamaica to ask a question, my dear. The world today, what's your name? Antoinette Fairweather. The world today is in the palm of our hands, you see. It's not like when you and that Mrs. Fairweather was growing up and we have to wait 3 to 6 weeks for our pen pal to respond to us. Unfortunately, if you did not realize, the world has moved on and it's growing at quite a speed that you will need to catch up with, because we can all keep up with the happenings of whatever is going on around the world, and in a particular country like ours, where we have a lot of contacts and we can zoom into, then it's perfectly okay for a blogger like me to sit in the UK and ask relevant questions of things that are happening in my country. This is how democracy and your freedom of speech work, and your right to have your freedom of thought and conscience, and that allows you to do public speculation. It allows you to ask questions. It's not that I'm out here making a statement. I'm asking questions, which is the way to get answers, is a way by asking questions. Even when someone don't acknowledge your question or isn't responding to that, it does not mean that you shouldn't ask the question. Because if you don't ask the question, you probably might not get the answer. Okay, Mrs. Fairweather? So yes, do it like the FBI would do it, Fitzdaily. Knock on every goddamn door that the evidence point to that Silvera contacted. And if it can be established that that person, Fitzdaily, knew before mid-December that Mrs. Silvera was murdered, and they said nothing to the authority, then by all means, they're covering up a crime. It's not that when you're on the scene of a crime and you decide to shut up, a scene of a crime that the authorities are investigating, and you decide to not give witness statement or whatever to what you see, that's a different thing. When you witness a crime or you visited the scene of a crime and then you did not report it, and the narrative been put out that escaped the whole crime, and you stay silent to it, you're a part of the cover-up. That doesn't allow you to say It's not my business, so I stayed silent. If you visited the scene, particularly in the Silvera's case, if you visited the Silvera's residence and you realize it was a crime before the pathology report, then that person ought to be investigated as a part of the cover-up. It's just how normal democracies would work in these type of investigation. The killing of Mrs. Silvera wasn't the only crime committed here. Don't be under that illusion. And if it's Bailey want to have us under that illusion, then we know the corrupt is deep and wide. Peter Bunting, Dayton Campbell, the wife of the prominent politician, the sergeant who visited the scene on his own, which isn't the protocol. We need to focus on that sergeant. Fitzbailey need to update us on the investigation around that sergeant. There is an investigation around that sergeant that Fitzbailey talked to us about in public. We know the investigation may not have concluded, but Fitzbailey should be in a position to give us some form of update. In this investigation, to see if the officer who initially attended the scene followed the right protocol, it doesn't take an awful long investigation, you know. It really doesn't take an awful long investigation. If it not be that Fitzbailey and the JCF, if it not be that Fitzbailey and the JCF is trying to hide, is trying to protect the sergeant, is trying to protect the sergeant that was involved in the cover-up, that was meant to do his duty, that was meant to do his duty, that lacked the protocol, lacked following, refused to follow the right protocol by not visiting the scene in double. If he accepted a personal call from Silvera, rather than going through the proper protocol, a whole lot of zooming, a whole lot of zooming in, need to focus on that inquiry rather Fitzbailey is having into the sergeant. That is something that we need to pressure Fitzbailey on. We need a report from Fitzbailey on that. Such an inquiry doesn't awfully take long. And we shouldn't let Fitzbailey drag it out like the Donnelly situation, this inquiry into whether the sergeant did his job correctly or not, or for that matter, whether the sergeant is involved in a cover-up. That doesn't take long to establish, like literally. It does not take long to establish. So while Fitzbailey is telling us about the integrity of the JCF, Fitzbailey also ought to clear up in public how his member approach the whole Silvera issue that allowed the cover-up to run for about 5 weeks before it was exposed. I want to thank you all very much to be here tonight. I'm going to end now, but you all, if you have your social media page, continue to ask Fitz Bailey, what part did the sergeant, what role did the sergeant play in the cover-up? And what is the timeline by which we will receive an update or a report from the inquiry you're having or the investigation you're having into the initial investigation on the night of the 10th of November into the morning of the 11th of November 2023. The probe does not stop and will not stop because JCF and the politicians are still on a limb to draw the sheet, that white sheet of white collar crime, back over their dirty deeds. We should not allow them. Continue to ask the question. Continue to keep the issue highlighted. Continue to press them in public. Continue to press them in public because we should not allow them to keep committing crime, but not only that, to cover it up and get away with it. Thank you very much for being here with me on Global TV tonight. To those on Twitch, on the X, on Facebook, on YouTube, good night and thank you for joining us. Once again, to my TikTok viewers, if any of you are over here, I am awfully sorry. I am awfully sorry that I did not broadcast on TikTok all day today. But as you all are aware, tomorrow is my day off. Unless there is a major development in the Melissa Silvera's investigation, I shall have my rest until Sunday night when I will be back at 11 p.m. UK time, 6 a.m. Eastern time, to continue the probe, the conversation, the highlighting of issues, and we also await the date of the local government election, where that would kick us straight into our electioneering broadcast, where we will eat, sleep, drink, rest, and play election night and day. Good night from Global TV. Thank you for joining us. This was our special coverage.